The bullet should have killed him, but Marshal Wyatt Vance opened his eyes 3 weeks after the outlaw's gun had roared in the dusty street of Shoshone, Idaho, to find a woman he had never met sleeping in a chair beside his bed, her hand wrapped around his. The late summer heat of 1882 pressed through the curtains of Doc Morrison's boarding house, where the physician kept his most critical patients. Wyatt's mouth felt like sandpaper, his throat refused to work properly, and every muscle in his body screamed in protest as he tried to move. The woman stirred at his slight motion, her dark blonde hair falling across her face as she lifted her head. When her green eyes met his, they widened with such relief and joy that Wyatt felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with his injuries. "You're awake," she whispered, her voice hoarse and breaking. "Oh God, you're finally awake." Before Wyatt could form words, she was out the door, calling for Doc Morrison. Within moments, the elderly physician rushed into the room, his spectacles sliding down his nose as he leaned over to examine his patient. The woman hovered at the foot of the bed, wringing her hands, her dress rumpled and stained as though she had been wearing it for days. "Can you hear me, Marshal?" Doc Morrison asked, holding up fingers. "How many do you see?" "3, Wyatt managed to croak. "Water." The woman moved immediately, pouring water from a pitcher into a glass with shaking hands. She brought it to his lips, supporting his head with surprising gentleness as he drank. Her fingers were cool against his fevered skin, and Wyatt found himself studying her face as he swallowed. She was beautiful in an unconventional way, with freckles scattered across her nose and cheekbones that spoke of someone who spent time outdoors. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her lips were chapped and pale. "That's enough for now," Doc Morrison said, and the woman pulled the glass away reluctantly. "Marshal Vance, you've been unconscious for 21 days. The bullet entered your chest near your heart. By all accounts, you should be dead. This young lady has been here every single day, keeping watch over you." Wyatt's gaze shifted to the woman, confusion clouding his thoughts. "Do I know you?" Pain flashed across her features so quickly he almost missed it. "No, Marshal. My name is Margaret Jensen. I'm the one who shot you." The words hung in the air like smoke after gunfire. Wyatt tried to process what she had said, but his mind felt sluggish, foggy. Doc Morrison cleared his throat and placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Perhaps I should explain," the doctor said. 3 weeks ago, the Dalton gang rode into Shoshone. They'd been terrorizing towns across Idaho territory, robbing banks and killing anyone who stood in their way. You confronted them in front of the bank. There was a shootout. Miss Jensen here was trapped inside during the robbery. When Frank Dalton got the drop on you, preparing to shoot you in the back while you were reloading, she grabbed a gun from one of the dead gang members and fired. She was aiming for Dalton, but her shot went wide and hit you instead. "Dalton's bullet would have killed you instantly," Margaret added, her voice barely audible. "Mine gave you a chance. I hit you in the chest, but Doc says it missed your heart by less than an inch. Frank Dalton's aim was true for your head. When I fired, you turned, and his bullet grazed your skull instead of going through it." Wyatt absorbed this information slowly. He had vague memories of the day, fragmented images of men with bandanas over their faces, the smell of gunpowder, the sound of screaming. He remembered drawing his pistol, remembered the methodical calm that always settled over him in dangerous situations. But he did not remember being shot, and he certainly did not remember this woman. "The gang?" he asked. "Dead or captured?" Doc Morrison said. "You got 3 of them before you went down. The sheriff and his deputies finished the rest. Frank Dalton was killed by Miss Jensen. After she shot you, she turned the gun on him and put 2 bullets in his chest." Wyatt looked at Margaret with new respect. "You saved my life, and you killed Frank Dalton." I nearly killed you, she corrected, tears welling in her eyes. I've been sitting here for 3 weeks, praying you'd wake up, praying I'd have the chance to apologize, to tell you how sorry I am. I've never fired a gun before that day. I was terrified and shaking, and I almost took your life because I couldn't hold the weapon steady. But you didn't, Wyatt said, his voice growing stronger despite the pain that radiated through his chest with every breath. You saved it. If what Doc says is true, Frank Dalton would have killed me. You gave me a chance. Margaret shook her head and tears spilled down her cheeks. I couldn't leave. I couldn't go home knowing that you might die because of what I did. I had to be here. I had to know that you'd wake up. Doc Morrison patted her shoulder. She hasn't left this room except to use the facilities and to step outside for fresh air twice a day. She's barely eaten. The whole town's been talking about it. Some folks think she's crazy. Others think she's the most loyal woman they've ever seen. I think she's been torturing herself unnecessarily, but she wouldn't listen to reason. I need to rest, Wyatt said, suddenly exhausted from the brief conversation. His eyelids felt heavy and darkness pulled at the edges of his vision. But Miss Jensen, please don't leave. When I wake again, I'd like to talk to you properly. Relief washed over her face and she nodded quickly. I'll be right here, Marshal. I promise. As Wyatt drifted back into sleep, he felt her hand slip into his again, warm and solid and real. For the first time in 3 weeks, Margaret Jensen allowed herself to believe that everything might actually be all right. When Wyatt woke again, the room was dark except for the soft glow of a lantern turned low. Margaret was still there, sitting in her chair, but this time she was awake, reading a book by the dim light. She noticed his stirring immediately and set the book aside. "How do you feel?" she asked softly. "Like I was shot," Wyatt replied, and was rewarded with a small smile from her. "How long was I asleep?" "About 6 hours. Doc says you need to drink more water and try to eat something if you can." She had a glass ready before he could ask, helping him drink again with the same gentle touch. This time, Wyatt was more alert, more aware of his surroundings. The room was small but clean, with whitewashed walls and simple furniture. His gun belt hung on a peg near the door, his hat resting on a table beneath it. Someone had changed him into a nightshirt, and bandages wrapped his chest tightly, making breathing difficult. "Tell me about yourself," Wyatt said after he finished drinking. "Where are you from? What brought you to Shoshone?" Margaret settled back into her chair, and for the first time Wyatt saw some of the tension leave her shoulders. "I came to Idaho Territory 6 months ago from Ohio. My parents died last year within weeks of each other, and I had nothing keeping me there. My uncle owns the general store here in Shoshone. He offered me a job and a place to live, so I took the stage west. I've been working in his store, learning the business. You came all this way alone." "I did. People thought I was foolish, a young woman traveling to the frontier by herself, but I couldn't stay in Ohio. Everything there reminded me of my parents, of the life I'd lost. I needed a fresh start." Wyatt understood that feeling more than she could know. "I came to Idaho Territory for similar reasons. Too many memories back in Kansas, too many ghosts. Sometimes a man needs to leave his past behind and start over." "Is that what you did? Started over, tried to, became a lawman because it was the only thing I knew how to do well." "I've been the marshal here for 2 years now. Shoshone's been mostly peaceful, just the occasional drunk or petty thief. The Dalton gang was the worst trouble we've seen since I arrived." Margaret nodded, her expression turning somber. "I was in the store when they rode in. Uncle Thomas was with me. We heard the shooting and looked out to see them dismounting in front of the bank. Uncle Thomas told me to hide in the back room, but I wanted to see what was happening. I watched through the window as you walked out into the street to face them." "That was foolish of me," Wyatt admitted. I should have waited for backup, should have organized a proper response. But I saw them and I just reacted. Old habits from my younger days. You were brave, Margaret said firmly. You stood there alone against 5 armed men because it was the right thing to do. Everyone in town is saying you're a hero. A hero who got himself shot and nearly killed. A hero who saved this town from murderers and thieves, she corrected. If you hadn't confronted them when you did, they would have killed everyone in that bank and probably burned half the town on their way out. That's what they did in Silver City last month. They talked through the night, their conversation flowing easily despite the unusual circumstances. Wyatt learned that Margaret was 23 years old, that she loved books and had dreams of maybe opening a small library in Shoshone one day. She had a quick wit and a sharp mind, and she asked him thoughtful questions about his life and his work. In turn, he told her about growing up in Kansas, about learning to shoot when he was barely tall enough to hold a rifle, about the brother he'd lost to cholera, and the woman who'd broken his heart before he came west. Doc Morrison checked on them twice during the night, bringing broth for Wyatt and insisting that Margaret eat something as well. The doctor seemed pleased to see his patient alert and talking, and he examined the wound with careful hands. It's healing well, Doc Morrison announced. No signs of infection, though I was worried about that for the first week. Your fever broke on the 10th day, and since then, you've been stable. I think you're going to make a full recovery, Marshal, though it's going to take time. You'll need to stay in bed for at least another 2 weeks, maybe more. Wyatt groaned at the prospect of being bedridden, but he knew better than to argue with the doctor. Doc Morrison had been practicing medicine for 40 years, and his word was law when it came to medical matters. As dawn broke over Shoshone, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Margaret finally allowed exhaustion to claim her. She fell asleep in her chair, her head tilted at an awkward angle, and Wyatt watched her with growing fondness. This woman, this stranger, had nearly killed him by accident, and then had devoted 3 weeks of her life to making sure he survived. The dedication, the loyalty, the sheer determination that must have required was staggering. Over the following days, Wyatt grew stronger. He graduated from broth to solid food, managed to sit up without feeling like his chest was being torn apart, and could stay awake for longer periods. Margaret remained his constant companion, though Doc Morrison and Wyatt both insisted she go home to her uncle's house to sleep in a proper bed at night. She resisted at first, but eventually agreed when Wyatt pointed out that she would be no good to him if she collapsed from exhaustion. The town's residents began visiting once word spread that the marshal was awake and recovering. Sheriff Tom Garrett came by with reports about the captured gang members and news that the territorial governor had sent a commendation for Wyatt's bravery. The mayor visited to thank him personally for saving the town. Several women from the church brought food and flowers, clucking over his condition like concerned hens. Through it all, Margaret was there, managing the visitors, protecting his rest, and making sure he followed Doc Morrison's orders. Wyatt found himself looking forward to her arrival each morning, found his mood brightening the moment she walked through the door. They continued their long conversations, sharing stories and dreams, learning about each other in the intimate way that only comes from spending hours together with nothing to do but talk. "I think I'm falling in love with you," Wyatt said one afternoon, about 10 days after he'd woken up. The words surprised him as much as they surprised her, but he realized they were true. "I know that's probably not something I should say, given the circumstances, but I'm not a man who believes in holding back the truth." Margaret's eyes widened, and color flooded her cheeks. "Marshal Vance, I don't think you know what you're saying. You're still recovering, you're not thinking clearly." My mind's never been clearer, Wyatt insisted. Margaret, you've been by my side through the worst of this. You've seen me at my weakest, most vulnerable. You've cared for me, talked with me, made me laugh even when it hurt to breathe. I've never met anyone like you. You're brave and kind and fiercely loyal. You're beautiful and intelligent, and you make me want to be a better man. You don't owe me anything, Margaret said, her voice shaking. I shot you. Everything I've done since then has been to try to make up for that, to try to atone for nearly killing you. Is that all this has been? Atonement? She stood abruptly, moving to the window, her back to him. Wyatt could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the windowsill. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. No. It started that way, but it stopped being about guilt somewhere around the 5th or 6th day. You were burning with fever, delirious, calling out names I didn't recognize. Doc Morrison said you probably wouldn't make it through the night. I held your hand and I prayed harder than I've ever prayed in my life, and I realized that I couldn't bear the thought of you dying. Not because I'd been the one to shoot you, but because I wanted the chance to know you, to talk to you, to see your eyes open and hear your voice. Margaret, look at me. She turned slowly, and Wyatt could see tears on her cheeks. I'm terrified, she admitted. I'm terrified that what I feel for you isn't real, that it's just relief that you survived mixed up with guilt over what I did. I'm terrified that you only think you love me because I've been here and you're grateful. Come here, Wyatt said, extending his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Margaret crossed the room and took it. He pulled her down to sit on the edge of the bed, keeping her hand in his. I've been thinking about this a lot over the past few days. I've asked myself the same questions. But here's what I know. I've never felt this way before. When you walk into the room, everything gets brighter. When you laugh, I feel it in my chest, right here next to where the bullet hit. When you talk about your dreams, I find myself wanting to be part of them. That's not gratitude, Margaret, that's love. But we barely know each other. We've spent more time together in the past month than most courting couples spend in 6 months. We've talked about everything under the sun. I know your favorite color is blue, like the sky just after sunrise. I know you're afraid of spiders, but you'd never kill one because you think all creatures deserve to live. I know you cry when you read sad stories, and that you have a terrible singing voice, but you sing anyway when you think no one's listening. I know that you're the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever met. Margaret laughed through her tears. You heard me singing. Oh, that's mortifying. It was beautiful, Wyatt said, smiling. Terrible, but beautiful. She wiped at her eyes with her free hand. I love you too. I think I started falling in love with you when you woke up, and the first thing you did was thank me for saving you instead of blaming me for shooting you. I think I fell deeper when you asked me to stay, when you looked at me like I mattered, like I was important. And I know I'm completely in love with you now, hearing you say these things to me. Wyatt tugged gently on her hand, pulling her closer. Then kiss me, and stop worrying about whether we're being logical or sensible. The heart doesn't care about logic. Margaret leaned down carefully, mindful of his injuries, and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle and tentative at first, but it deepened quickly, becoming something more certain, more real. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and Wyatt felt like his heart might burst from the emotion swelling in his chest. When I'm healed, he said, I'm going to court you properly. I'm going to take you to dinner at the hotel restaurant, and we're going to walk together through town, and I'm going to show everyone in Shoshone that you're mine and I'm yours. I'd like that, Margaret said, her smile radiant. I'd like that very much. Doc Morrison released Wyatt from his care 3 weeks after he'd woken from the coma. The Marshal was still healing, still moved carefully to avoid straining his wound, but he was strong enough to return to his small house on the edge of town. Margaret helped him settle in, fussing over the sparse furnishings and the lack of proper curtains. "This place needs a woman's touch," she declared, hands on her hips as she surveyed the main room. "It's depressing, Marshal Vance." "Wyatt," he corrected, lowering himself into his only comfortable chair. "I think you've earned the right to use my first name." "Wyatt," she repeated, testing the name. "It suits you. And your place needs books and flowers and maybe some color on the walls," he added. "When we're married, you can decorate however you'd like." Margaret froze in the middle of adjusting a crooked picture frame. "When we're married? That's rather presumptuous of you, Marshal." "Is it?" Wyatt raised an eyebrow. "Are you saying you don't want to marry me?" "I'm saying you haven't asked me properly." "Fair enough." Wyatt started to push himself up from the chair, grimacing at the pull in his chest. "What are you doing? Sit back down before you hurt yourself." "A man should be on his knee when he proposes," Wyatt said stubbornly. Margaret rushed over and pressed him back into the chair. "You are not getting on your knee. You'll tear your stitches and Doc Morrison will have both our heads. Ask me from right there." Wyatt took her hand, his expression turning serious. "Margaret Jensen, I know we've only known each other for a short time, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. You are the most extraordinary woman I've ever met. You're brave and loyal and kind, and you make me want to be the best version of myself. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears again, but these were tears of joy. "Yes, yes, of course I'll marry you." They were married 6 weeks later in Shoshone's small church. The entire town turned out for the wedding, eager to celebrate the unlikely romance between the marshal, who'd nearly died, and the woman who'd shot him. Margaret wore a simple white dress that her aunt had helped her sew, and Wyatt wore his best suit, though he still moved carefully, his chest still tender. The ceremony was short and sweet, with Reverend Thomas officiating. When Wyatt kissed his bride, the church erupted in applause and cheers. At the reception afterward, held in the town square, dozens of people came up to offer their congratulations and well wishes. Sheriff Garrett made a toast about love conquering all obstacles, even gunshot wounds, which made everyone laugh. Margaret's Uncle Thomas welcomed Wyatt into the family with a hearty handshake and a warning to take good care of his niece. As the sun set and lanterns were lit around the square, Wyatt and Margaret shared their first dance as husband and wife. Wyatt moved slowly, still favoring his left side, but Margaret didn't care. She rested her head against his shoulder and let him guide her through the simple steps. "Happy," Wyatt murmured into her hair. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Margaret replied. "Who would have thought that accidentally shooting someone could lead to this?" "I think it was fate," Wyatt said. "The universe's strange way of bringing us together, though I could have done without the pain and the coma." Margaret laughed, the sound bright and clear in the evening air. "Next time I'll try a less dramatic approach to meeting someone." "There better not be a next time," Wyatt growled playfully. "You're stuck with me now, Mrs. Vance." "I can live with that, Mr. Vance. I can definitely live with that." They moved into Wyatt's house, which Margaret immediately began transforming. She sewed curtains for the windows, bought a rug for the floor, and filled every available surface with books. She planted flowers in the small yard and convinced Wyatt to build her some shelves for her growing collection of novels. The house slowly became a home, warm and welcoming, and filled with love. Wyatt returned to his duties as marshal once Doc Morrison declared him fully healed, though Margaret made him promise to be more careful. The town remained peaceful through the fall and into winter, with only minor disturbances that required his attention. Margaret continued working at her uncle's store, but she also began organizing a small lending library in the back room, offering books to anyone in town who wanted to borrow them. Their first winter together was harsh, with heavy snowfalls that blanketed Shoshone in white. On the coldest nights, Wyatt and Margaret would sit by the fire, her reading aloud while he cleaned his guns or whittled small figures from wood. They talked about their hopes for the future, about maybe having children one day, about growing old together in this small Idaho town they'd both come to love in the spring. Margaret discovered she was pregnant. She told Wyatt over breakfast one morning, her hands shaking slightly as she shared the news. Wyatt's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. He swept her into his arms, spinning her around despite her protests, laughing with pure joy. They would have a child, a family, a future that extended beyond just the two of them. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Margaret suffered from terrible morning sickness during the first few months. Wyatt hovered constantly, much to her alternating amusement and annoyance. He treated her like she was made of glass, rushing to help her with even the smallest tasks until she finally snapped at him to stop coddling her. "I'm pregnant, not dying," she informed him tartly one afternoon when he tried to carry a basket of laundry for her. "I'm perfectly capable of doing normal things." "I know," Wyatt said, looking sheepish. "I just worry. I almost lost you before I even really had you. The thought of anything happening to you or the baby terrifies me." Margaret's expression softened. "Nothing's going to happen. Doc Morrison says I'm healthy and strong. The baby's growing well. You need to trust that everything will be fine." "I'll try," Wyatt promised, though they both knew he'd continue to fuss and worry until the baby was safely delivered. Their son was born on a cold December morning in 1883, just over a year after Wyatt had woken from his coma. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Wyatt feared he might lose Margaret after all. But she was strong, pushing through the pain with determination and courage, and when the baby finally arrived, his lusty cries filled the house with sound and life. "It's a boy," Doc Morrison announced, placing the squalling infant in Margaret's arms. "A healthy baby boy." Wyatt looked down at his wife and son and felt something break open in his chest. Margaret was exhausted, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, but she'd never looked more beautiful. The baby had a shock of dark hair and surprisingly bright eyes that seemed to look right at Wyatt. "He's perfect," Wyatt whispered, touching one tiny fist with his finger. The baby's hand opened and then closed around his finger, gripping with surprising strength. "He's absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" Margaret asked, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. They'd discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but nothing had felt quite right. Wyatt looked at his son, this small miracle who represented everything good in his life, and suddenly he knew. "Matthew," he said. "Matthew Thomas Vance, after your uncle who gave you a home when you needed one." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. "Uncle Thomas will be so honored. Matthew." "Yes, I love it." The first year of Matthew's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and precious moments. Wyatt discovered a capacity for love he hadn't known existed, marveling at every milestone, every smile, every new sound his son made. Margaret bloomed in motherhood, patient and nurturing, singing lullabies to their baby in her terrible voice that somehow sounded perfect in those quiet moments. Shoshone continued to grow and prosper. More families arrived, drawn by the promise of good land and opportunities. New businesses opened, including a proper school that hired a teacher from back east. Margaret's lending library expanded, moving from the back room of her uncle's store to its own small building that Wyatt and several other men constructed over the course of a summer. She was able to order books from catalogs, building a collection that served the entire community. When Matthew was 2 years old, Margaret became pregnant again. This time, she delivered a daughter, a tiny thing with blonde hair and green eyes that were the mirror image of her mother's. They named her Elizabeth Mee, and she was every bit as adored as her brother. The years rolled by, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Matthew grew tall and strong, with his father's steady nature and his mother's quick mind. Elizabeth was fierce and independent, climbing trees and demanding to learn to ride horses almost before she could walk properly. Wyatt watched his family expand and flourish with deep contentment, grateful every day for the strange twist of fate that had brought Margaret into his life. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Wyatt and Margaret stood together on the porch of their house, watching the sunset paint the Idaho sky in brilliant colors. The children were inside with Margaret's uncle and aunt, who'd come to watch them for the evening so the couple could have some time alone. "Do you ever think about how we met?" Margaret asked, leaning against her husband's side. "Every day," Wyatt admitted. "I think about waking up to find you there, about not knowing who you were, but knowing somehow that you were important. I think about how you saved my life twice, once when you fired that gun and once when you refused to leave my side." "I think about how terrified I was," Margaret said. "How certain I was that you'd die and it would be my fault. I think about falling in love with you while you were unconscious, talking to you for hours even though you couldn't hear me, telling you all my secrets and dreams." "I heard some of it," Wyatt revealed. "Not words exactly, but I remember your voice, remember the feeling of your hand in mine. It pulled me back when I was drifting away." Margaret turned to face him fully, reaching up to touch his face. The scar from where Frank Dalton's bullet had grazed his skull was barely visible now, hidden by his hair. The scar on his chest was more prominent, a raised ridge of tissue that she traced sometimes at night, a reminder of how close she'd come to losing him. "I love you," she said simply. "I've loved you for 10 years, and I'll love you for 50 more if we're blessed with that much time." "I love you too," Wyatt replied, pulling her close. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Margaret Vance. You and our children, this life we've built together. It's more than I ever dreamed of having." They kissed as the sun disappeared below the horizon, the sky darkening to deep purple and then to black. Stars began to emerge, scattered across the heavens like diamonds on velvet. Inside the house, they could hear their children laughing, the sound bright and joyful. Life in Shoshone continued its steady rhythm. Wyatt served as marshal for another 15 years before finally retiring, passing the badge to a younger man who reminded him of himself in his earlier days. He spent his retirement helping Margaret at the library, which had grown to include over 1,000 volumes, and teaching Matthew and Elizabeth to shoot and ride. He became a grandfather when Matthew married a schoolteacher named Sarah and had 2 sons of his own. Elizabeth surprised everyone by becoming a deputy marshal, following in her father's footsteps, despite the raised eyebrows and whispered comments about it being unsuitable work for a woman. Margaret's health remained strong throughout the years, though her hair turned gray and lines appeared around her eyes and mouth. Wyatt thought she grew more beautiful with age, her face reflecting the life they'd lived together, the joys and sorrows, the laughter and tears. She continued running the library until she was well into her 60s, finally stepping back to let a younger librarian take over the daily operations. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary surrounded by family and friends. Matthew and Sarah were there with their 3 sons. Elizabeth came with her husband, a quiet rancher she'd married 5 years earlier, and their young daughter. Uncle Thomas had passed away years before, but his wife attended, elderly but still sharp as a tack. Sheriff Garrett, now retired like Wyatt, raised a toast to the couple. 40 years ago, I watched these two fall in love in the strangest circumstances I've ever seen, Garrett said, his voice wavering with age. Margaret shot Wyatt, then sat by his bedside for 3 weeks straight, and somehow that led to the greatest love story Shoshone's ever known. They've been an example to all of us about what marriage should be, what love can be when two people commit to each other fully. Here's to 40 more years. Everyone cheered and drank, though both Wyatt and Margaret knew that 40 more years was unlikely. They were both in their 70s now, their bodies showing the wear of age. But they were together and they were happy, and that was more than enough. On a warm summer evening in their 43rd year of marriage, Wyatt and Margaret sat together on their porch, holding hands as they had so many times before. The sun was setting, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and pink. Their children and grandchildren had visited earlier, filling the house with noise and life before departing to their own homes. "It's been a good life," Wyatt said quietly, "better than I ever imagined possible." "The best life," Margaret agreed. "I wouldn't change a single thing, not even accidentally shooting you." Wyatt chuckled. "Especially not that. If you hadn't shot me, we might never have met. You'd probably have married some boring shopkeeper, and I'd have died old and alone with nothing but my badge and my memories." "Instead, we got this," Margaret said, gesturing to encompass everything, the house they'd built together, the town they'd helped grow, the family they'd created. "We got love and children and grandchildren and a lifetime of moments just like this one." "Just like this one," Wyatt echoed, squeezing her hand gently. They sat together as the stars emerged, talking quietly about nothing and everything, the conversation comfortable and familiar after so many years. When they finally went inside, Wyatt helped Margaret up the stairs to their bedroom, his movements slower now but still steady. They lay down together, Margaret curling into Wyatt's side as she had every night for over 4 decades. "Good night, my love," she whispered. "Good night, Margaret," Wyatt replied, kissing the top of her head. "Thank you for shooting me." She laughed softly, the sound warm and familiar in the darkness. "Thank you for waking up." They fell asleep together, hands intertwined. Two souls bound by a love that had started with a bullet and a vigil, and had grown into something eternal. Outside, Shoshone slept peacefully under the stars, the town they'd both loved and served, the place where their story had unfolded. Inside their home, surrounded by photographs and memories, by books and mementos of a life well lived, Wyatt and Margaret Vance rested in each other's arms, content and complete, their hearts beating in perfect rhythm until the very end. The legacy they left behind was more than just children and grandchildren, though those were precious beyond measure. They'd shown an entire community what real love looked like, what devotion and loyalty and commitment meant. Young couples in Shoshone would tell their story for generations, the tale of the marshal who was shot and the woman who kept vigil, of how tragedy and accident could transform into the deepest love. The library Margaret had built continued to serve the town, expanded and renamed in her honor after her passing. The values of courage and integrity that Wyatt had embodied as Marshal became the standard for all who followed him. But perhaps their greatest legacy was simpler than all of that. It was in the way Matthew held his wife's hand when they walked through town, the gesture so reminiscent of how his father had held his mother's. It was in the fierce independence and strength Elizabeth showed as she raised her daughter to be bold and unafraid. It was in the grandchildren who grew up hearing stories about love conquering all obstacles, who learned that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected circumstances. It was in the great-grandchildren who would never meet them but would carry forward the lessons they'd taught, the example they'd set. On the mantel in Matthew's home sat a framed photograph taken on Wyatt and Margaret's 30th anniversary. In it, they stood together in front of their house, his arm around her waist, both of them smiling at the camera with genuine joy and love. Next to the photograph was a small wooden box containing two items: Wyatt's marshal's badge and the bullet Doc Morrison had removed from his chest all those years ago. These were treasures, reminders of where the love story had begun, of how close it had come to never happening at all. Years after both Wyatt and Margaret had passed, a journalist visiting Shoshone heard their story and decided to write an article about it for a San Francisco newspaper. The piece was titled "The Bullet That Built a Love Story," and it captured the essence of their relationship, the unlikely beginning and the beautiful life that had followed. The article was reprinted in newspapers across the West, and people everywhere were moved by the tale of devotion and love. But for those who had known them, who had watched their love unfold over more than 4 decades, no article or story could truly capture what Wyatt and Margaret had shared. It was in the small moments, the quiet gestures, the way they'd looked at each other even after all those years as if they were still newlyweds discovering love for the first time. It was in how they'd faced every challenge together, weathering storms both literal and metaphorical without ever losing faith in each other. It was in the way they'd built not just a family but a community, enriching the lives of everyone around them through their example. The old church where they'd married still stood in the center of Shoshone, though it had been expanded twice to accommodate the growing congregation. Young couples getting married there would often hear about Wyatt and Margaret, about the marshal and the woman who shot him, and they'd stand at the same altar where those vows had been exchanged and hope that their own love could be half as strong, half as enduring. The house they'd lived in remained in the family, passed down to Matthew, and then to his eldest son. Each generation added their own touches while preserving the essential character of the home. The porch where Wyatt and Margaret had spent countless evenings remained unchanged, the same boards creaking under footsteps, the same view of the sunset painting the Idaho sky in brilliant colors. On warm summer nights, their descendants would sometimes sit there, holding hands with their own partners, feeling the presence of those who'd come before and set such a profound example. In the library that bore Margaret's name, a plaque hung in the entryway with words Wyatt had written shortly after her death. She believed in the power of stories to change lives, to open minds, to build bridges between people. She lived a story worth telling, a life worth celebrating, a love worth remembering. May all who enter here find the same joy in books that she found, and may they carry her spirit of generosity and warmth into the world. The cemetery on the hill outside Shoshone held their graves, side by side as they'd been in life. The headstones were simple, bearing their names and dates, but also a shared inscription chosen by their children. Together in life, together in death, forever in love. Flowers were placed there regularly, not just by family but by townspeople who remembered them or who knew their story and were moved by it. As the years turned into decades, and the decades approached a century since that fateful day when Frank Dalton and his gang had ridden into Shoshone, the story of Wyatt and Margaret Vance became the stuff of legend. Historians studying the period would come across references to them in old newspapers and journals. Romance novelists would use their tale as inspiration for fictional stories. But the truth was more powerful than any fiction could be, because it was real, because it had actually happened, because two people had found each other in the most unlikely way and had built a love that lasted a lifetime. Their great-great-grandchildren, living in a world vastly different from the frontier Idaho territory of the 1880s, would gather around dinner tables and ask to hear the story again. And the tale would be told once more, passed down through the generations, each telling adding to the richness and depth of the legend. The cowboy who woke from a coma to find a woman keeping vigil. The woman who'd accidentally shot the man she'd end up loving more than life itself. The 3 weeks of faithful waiting that had led to 43 years of unwavering devotion. It was a story about love, yes, but it was also about redemption, about second chances, about how the worst moments of our lives can sometimes lead to the best. Margaret had lived with the horror of shooting an innocent man, but that terrible act had given them both the gift of each other. Wyatt had nearly died, but in surviving, he'd found a reason to live that went beyond duty or honor. Together, they'd created something beautiful and lasting, something that transcended the circumstances of their meeting and became a testament to what love could be when it was nurtured and cherished and protected. In the end, theirs was a love story worthy of the Wild West itself, full of drama and danger and unlikely twists of fate. But it was also profoundly human, grounded in the everyday moments that make up a life, the conversations and touches and shared silences that bind two people together. It was the best kind of story, the kind that reminds us that love can find us anywhere, even in the most unexpected places, even when we're not looking for it, even when all seems lost. All we have to do is be brave enough to recognize it, strong enough to nurture it, and wise enough to never let it go. And that was the final, most important lesson that Wyatt and Margaret Vance taught everyone who knew them or heard their story. Love, true love, is worth any price, any sacrifice, any challenge. It is the one thing that makes all the rest worthwhile, the one thing that endures when everything else fades away. And that truth, carried forward by all who came after them, was perhaps the most valuable gift they could have given.